I don't talk about the cabin much anymore. Not because I don't remember. I remember all of it. Too clearly, in fact. I just learned that most people don't want to hear about things that don't have clean endings. They want resolution. A nice bow on top. Something they can process and forget. But that's not how this went. Last fall, I took time off work. I had been feeling burnt out, overwhelmed by city noise, people, routines. Everything felt like it was closing in. I wanted to be alone, somewhere quiet. A friend from college mentioned once that Oregon had great remote cabin rentals. Some deep in the forests, miles from civilization. That sounded perfect to me. I booked a cabin online through a rental site. It had good reviews, though not many. It was located off a Forest Service road about 2 hours from Eugene. The listing called it a secluded retreat for creatives. That appealed to me. I wasn't going there to write a novel or anything like that, but I liked the idea of space, trees, silence. Getting there wasn't easy. My phone lost signal halfway down the forest road. The GPS froze. I had to rely on printed directions I'd saved, just in case. The last stretch was nothing more than a dirt trail, winding through dense pines. The cabin sat in a small clearing, tucked between trees so tall they blocked most of the sky. It looked just like the photos. Single-story, wood-paneled, tin roof, a porch with a swing, a small fire pit out front. Rustic, but not run down. Inside, it was basic. One main room with a bed, a wood stove, a small kitchenette, a bathroom off to the side. The windows were small and didn't let in much light. There was a door in the kitchen that led to a crawl space underneath, I assumed for maintenance access. The door had a deadbolt. The first 2 days were peaceful. I read a lot, made simple meals, went for long walks through the trees. I liked the quiet. No cars, no neighbors, no signal. At night, it got dark. Not suburban dark, forest dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face without a flashlight. The silence at night was a little harder to get used to. Sometimes I thought I heard animals moving outside, but I figured it was just deer or raccoons. Normal stuff. On the third morning, I noticed something strange. My hiking boots weren't where I had left them. I always placed them by the front door, side by side. But when I woke up, they were about a foot apart. One was tilted on its side. I thought maybe I kicked one by accident when I came in, but I was pretty sure I hadn't. Still, I let it go. That same morning, I went to make coffee and noticed one of the mugs was missing. There were only 2. I had used the same one every day. The second one sat in the cupboard, unused, but now it was gone. I searched the cabin, checked the sink, the bathroom, even under the bed. Nothing. I figured maybe I took it outside and forgot. Maybe I left it by the fire pit. I checked. Nothing. I started to feel a little off. Not scared, just unsettled, like I was forgetting things. I told myself it was just the isolation. Maybe I was getting a little stir-crazy. That night, I plugged in my phone to charge. It was at 20%. I watched it charge for a bit before bed. I remember it hit 70% before I fell asleep. When I woke up, it was dead, completely drained. The cord was still in. I unplugged it and plugged it back in. Nothing. I checked the outlet. It worked with the lamp. I tried the charger on my small power bank. That worked too. The phone wasn't charging at all now. That's when I really started to feel uneasy. Not panicked, not yet. Just aware. Aware that something wasn't quite right. I spent that day trying to stay busy. I hiked a few miles. I kept looking behind me on the trail. No one was there. When I got back, I checked the cabin again for the mug. Still gone. I looked for signs of animals getting in, droppings, scratches, paw prints. Nothing. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. Every sound felt amplified. Branches shifting, leaves rustling, something tapping against the wall. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding, eyes wide open. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, I found the deadbolt on the crawl space door undone. I was sure I locked it when I arrived. I remembered doing it. It was one of the first things I checked, just out of habit. I stood there staring at it for a long time. The door was shut, but the bolt was slid open. That afternoon, I decided I needed to know if I was losing it or if something else was going on. I had brought a small GoPro with me just to capture nature stuff. I set it up on a shelf across from the bed, angled to see most of the cabin. I let it record that night while I slept. It was hard to fall asleep knowing the camera was on. I kept thinking about what it might catch. I didn't sleep deeply. I tossed and turned. Every time I opened my eyes, I looked toward the kitchen, but nothing happened, or at least I didn't see anything. The next morning, I checked the footage right away. I watched it from my laptop. It ran for almost 7 hours. At first, it was just me moving around, rolling over, adjusting the blanket. Nothing unusual. But then, around 3:40 a.m., I saw the kitchen door open, the crawlspace door. Slowly, quietly, the bolt was off so it moved without sound. A man emerged, crawled up. He stood there, bent a little from the low ceiling. He was barefoot, wearing jeans and a hoodie. I couldn't see his face clearly. He didn't come all the way into the room. He just stood in the shadows, staring at me, watching me sleep. He stayed like that for over 2 hours. Then, as the first light of morning started to come in, he turned, slipped back into the crawlspace, and shut the door behind him, quietly, like he'd done it before. I paused the video. My chest felt tight. I couldn't breathe for a second. My skin was cold. I sat there, shaking. I felt exposed, violated. He had been there while I slept, watching, not stealing, not attacking, just watching. I packed everything I could as fast as I could. Clothes, food, gear. I didn't even make sure it was all folded. I stuffed things into my backpack, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't even lock the door. I drove straight down the forest road, faster than I should have. I didn't stop until I hit a main road with signal. At a gas station, I called the police. They told me to meet them at a station in Eugene. I gave them everything, the footage, the location, the rental info, even the name of the host. They said they'd investigate. I never heard anything back. A month later, I called for an update. The officer I spoke to said the cabin was empty when they arrived. No sign of forced entry. No evidence anyone had been living in the crawlspace. Nothing missing. They said they canvassed the area but found no one. The host claimed not to know anything. Said the cabin was cleaned before I arrived. They even reviewed the GoPro footage. They saw what I saw, but they couldn't identify the man. The face never showed. No fingerprints were found. No match in the system. I asked if they thought he had been living there or just sneaking in from the woods. The officer said it was impossible to tell. He might have known the area well, might have been using the cabin regularly, slipping in and out without notice. Maybe even before it was rented out. That was it. Case open but cold. I didn't go back to work for a while. I didn't sleep well for months. Every creak of my apartment floor made me jump. I got locks for everything. I installed a camera in my hallway. I check it every night before bed. Eventually, life moved on. People stopped asking about my trip. I stopped bringing it up. It didn't feel real to them. Just another weird story from the woods. But it was real. Sometimes, when I wake up in the dark, I swear I feel eyes on me. Not in the room, in the memory, in that feeling of being watched so deeply, so quietly, that it leaves no trace. That man didn't take anything. He didn't hurt me, but he left something behind. A knowledge I never wanted. Someone can be there, right there, watching you, and you'd never know. I've gone over that weekend in my head more times than I can count. I keep trying to figure out what we could have done differently, where we made the wrong turn, not just on the trail but in the bigger sense. It's not something you walk away from clean. Even now, months later, I still jump at sounds at night. I still sleep with the lights on sometimes. There's a lot I can't explain, but I'll tell it exactly how it happened. My friend Nate and I had planned the trip for months. It was supposed to be a break. We were both in our last year of college, both burned out, and we figured a weekend off-grid in the Smoky Mountains would clear our heads. The idea was simple. No phones, no emails, no noise. Just a tiny, rented cabin way off the main road, the kind that doesn't even have cell service or plumbing. It was cheap and basic, and that was the appeal. We drove in early Friday morning. The roads narrowed the closer we got to the cabin, winding through the forest like a loose thread. By the time we reached the clearing where the cabin sat, we were far from anything. The last house we saw was at least 30 minutes back, and there were no other cars on the gravel road past that point. Just the woods, thick and quiet. The cabin itself was smaller than the pictures had made it seem. A one-room setup with a single bed, a wood stove, and an outhouse about 30 yards behind it. No electricity, just some old battery-powered lanterns and candles. We brought our own food, a camp stove, water jugs, and sleeping bags since we planned to take turns on the floor. The first night was peaceful. We set up a little fire pit, made some canned soup, and drank a couple of beers we'd stashed in a cooler. The air was crisp and cold, the kind that makes you feel clean just by breathing it in. The trees stood like walls around us, and for the first time in a while, I felt calm. I remember falling asleep to the sound of crickets and wind. Saturday morning, we made instant coffee over the stove and decided to go for a short hike. Nothing major, just a couple of hours out and back. We didn't take much, just a bottle of water each, some trail mix, and our jackets. Left everything else in the cabin, figuring it was isolated enough that no one would come by. That was mistake number one. The trail looped around a nearby ridge and dipped down into a valley before circling back. We stopped for a while at a little stream and skipped rocks. It was all normal, almost boring. But when we got back to the cabin around early afternoon, something was immediately off. The door was open, not all the way, just cracked, but we closed it tight when we left, and I remember pushing the old latch into place. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten in, but then I saw the window. The back window, the one above the bed, was shattered inward. Glass littered the floor like ice. Inside, everything had been pulled apart. Our backpacks emptied, the food scattered, our sleeping bags tossed aside. I walked in slowly, still thinking maybe it was a bear. But it didn't take long to realize that wasn't right. Our phones were gone, so were our wallets, keys, and even the map we'd brought. The cooler was still there, but the lid had been opened and everything inside dumped out. It was like someone had been looking for something. Even our socks and underwear had been pulled out and tossed around. Nate stood there frozen, just staring at the mess. I remember the sinking feeling in my stomach, like my body knew before my mind could catch up. I kept saying it out loud, trying to make sense of it. They took everything. They took everything. We checked outside and found the footprints, clear as day, leading from the broken window around the back of the cabin and into the woods. No boot treads, just bare feet. That part still gets me. Who the hell walks barefoot out there? We stood in silence for a while, not sure what to do. There was no reception, no car, and no one around for miles. We tried to follow the prints, but they disappeared quickly into the underbrush. Whoever it was knew where they were going. That night was the longest night of my life. We tried to block the broken window with some firewood and a blanket. It didn't do much. We took turns staying awake, though neither of us got any real sleep. Around midnight, I started hearing things outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon, but then I saw him. He was standing just beyond the tree line. A man, shirtless, barefoot, dirty. His skin looked gray in the moonlight, his hair long and matted. He didn't move, just stood there watching the cabin. I didn't say anything to Nate at first. I just froze, heart thudding so loud I swore it would give us away. After a while, the man disappeared back into the woods. A few minutes later, Nate whispered, "Did you see him?" That's when I knew it wasn't in my head. We stayed huddled in the corner of the cabin all night, clutching the fire poker and a kitchen knife like it would do anything if he came in. Every noise outside made us flinch. At one point, we heard what sounded like someone dragging something through the dirt. That sound still makes my skin crawl. I don't know if it was a stick, a bag, or something else, but it was real, and it was close. We waited for the sun. At first light, we packed up what little we had, 2 granola bars, a half-full water bottle, and a flashlight with dying batteries. We didn't even put on our shoes because they were gone too. Just walked barefoot, bruised and scraped. down the gravel road in the direction we'd come from 2 days earlier. The road felt longer than it had on the way in. Every step hurt. Our feet bled from sharp rocks and thorns. We had to stop every mile or so to rest. It was like the forest was closing in around us, watching. We didn't talk, just kept moving, hoping we'd find someone or something. Around the 8th mile, we saw a wooden trail marker and realized we were close to one of the park's main routes. That gave us a little hope. About 3 miles later, we reached a ranger station. An old wooden building with a tin roof and a small truck parked outside. I've never been so relieved to see a government vehicle in my life. The ranger inside, middle-aged guy with a thick beard, took one look at us and called for backup. We told him what happened, left nothing out. Deputies showed up a little while later and took our statements. We gave as much detail as we could about what was stolen, what we saw, what we heard. But we couldn't describe the man very well. It had been dark, and he never came closer than the trees. The deputies went back with us later that day in a squad vehicle. They found the cabin just like we left it. The window was still broken, the gear still missing, the mess untouched. The footprints had mostly faded by then. They said it was probably a squatter or someone living off-grid, maybe hiding from something. A fugitive, maybe. Someone who didn't want to be found. They never caught him, never found our stuff. We canceled our cards and replaced our IDs, but the phones and gear were gone. No leads, no arrests. The part that stays with me isn't what we lost, though. It's the feeling of being watched. The silence in the woods that night wasn't normal. It felt intentional, like we were part of some game we didn't understand. And the look on that man's face, if you could even call it a look, wasn't rage or desperation. It was curiosity, like he was studying us. I've had nightmares since. I dream about being back in that cabin, unable to move, hearing footsteps just outside the door. Sometimes I see that man's face through the broken window. Sometimes he gets in. But I'm here. We made it out. That's what I tell myself on bad days. We survived. Barefoot, cold, terrified, but alive. I haven't gone camping since. Nate hasn't either. We still talk sometimes, not as much as we used to, but when we do, the cabin always comes up eventually. We don't say much about it anymore. We just acknowledge that it happened, and then move on. We were lucky. I know that now. Could have ended 100 different ways, most of them worse. Whoever that man was, he could have done more than scare us. But he didn't, and that's the strangest part. He watched us, took our things, but he didn't hurt us. He let us go. Why? That's the question I can't shake. Not who was he, not where is he now, just why? We'll probably never know. But we learned something out there about how fragile safety is, how fast things can fall apart, and how far you're willing to go when you're scared out of your mind. 11 miles doesn't sound like much until you're walking it with bare feet and a head full of fear. It was supposed to be a break, a quiet weekend off the grid. But the woods don't care what you planned. They keep their own secrets, and sometimes they don't let go. I had been renting the same small cabin every fall for the past 6 years. It sat near the edge of a forgotten patch of forest in the northern part of Maine, the kind of place where the trees crowd the sky and daylight feels thinner even when the sun is high. I first found it through a retired guy who ran a barely maintained listing website for secluded getaways. It was cheap, quiet, off the grid, and in an area where no one really went unless they were trying to disappear for a bit. That's what I liked about it. It was just me, a wood stove, some old split logs out back, and nothing else. No cell reception, no internet, no roads within a few miles. You parked at the end of a barely there dirt path and hiked in with whatever you could carry. The guy who owned it just said, "Pack heavy and prepare to be alone." That suited me fine. I'd been dealing with a rough year, lost a job I cared about, had a breakup that left me colder than I expected, and the day-to-day noise of people had just gotten under my skin. I needed space and quiet, and that cabin always gave it to me. I got there in the middle of October, just before the frost really sets in. The leaves had turned already and were falling fast. I always liked arriving right at that moment when the woods start to feel hollow, like they're slowly giving up for the year. Everything was as I remembered. The door stuck a little when I opened it, the way it always had. The place smelled like cedar and old ash. A few dead flies sat on the windowsills. The woodpile looked smaller than usual, but I figured I could make it last if I was smart about burning only in the evenings and wearing layers during the day. Inside, the place was simple. One room with a cot, a few shelves, a small table, and a cast iron stove in the corner. No bathroom, just an outhouse down the hill and a small stream for water. I brought a little propane burner to boil water and cook some basics. That was it. That was the whole world for me for 2 weeks. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I hiked a little. I read. I wrote in a notebook about nothing in particular. I listened to the wind slide through the trees. When it rained, it tapped gently on the tin roof. When it was dry, the woods outside made a soft crackling noise, like they were settling into place. But on the fourth night, something changed. I'd gone to bed a little earlier than usual, maybe around 10. The woods were colder than the nights before. I loaded the stove with a few thick logs and closed the damper. I curled into my sleeping bag, which I had laid across the old cot, and I fell asleep to the sound of the fire ticking in the stove. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound I didn't recognize. It was faint at first. I thought maybe it was just wind pushing a branch against the roof or a squirrel scratching somewhere. But then I realized it wasn't random or natural. It was rhythmic, slow and steady, a scraping noise, long and deliberate. It sounded like someone dragging something across the side of the cabin. I laid there, breathing shallow, hoping maybe I was still half asleep or imagining it. But the sound came again, this time along the back wall behind where the stove sat. A long, slow scratch, then silence. I sat up in the cot and listened hard. My heart had already started to pick up. I held my breath, trying to hear over the pulsing in my ears. Nothing moved. I thought about turning on my flashlight, but didn't. I didn't want to make light if something or someone was out there watching. After about 10 minutes, I started to calm down. I told myself it could have been a tree limb. Maybe the wind had picked up and something was dragging along the side of the cabin. There were a lot of possibilities. I didn't hear anything else, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. I checked for prints, but the ground was too hard. There were a few small rocks out back that had been moved slightly, but that could have been anything, an animal, maybe a deer. But then I noticed something that stopped me cold. On the back wall of the cabin, just below the window, were 3 long marks in the wood. They weren't deep like claw marks, but they were deliberate, like someone had taken a knife or a rock and slowly scraped along the boards. They were about 5 feet off the ground, almost chest height. I just stared at them. I had no idea what to think. It didn't look like damage from a falling branch or anything natural. It looked like someone marking the wall. I didn't have a gun, just a hatchet and a long camping knife. I usually didn't bring anything heavier. I'd never needed it. But standing there that morning, I wished I had. Still, I didn't pack up. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe it had been there last year and I just never noticed. Or maybe it was some kind of animal behavior I didn't recognize. I was deep in the woods. There were plenty of strange things out here. I tried to shake it off and carried on. That night, I made a fire in the stove and kept the hatchet close by. I left the flashlight next to me on the cot and didn't sleep quite as soundly. It was the next night when I started to really feel the weight of being alone out there. I had gone to sleep late, maybe after midnight. The fire had burned low, and the air inside the cabin had gotten cold. I woke up again, not from a sound, but from a feeling. Something was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the normal silence, the kind that feels peaceful and wide. This was different, tight, heavy, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then I heard it again, the scraping, this time on the front door. It wasn't loud. It was slow. I could hear the edge of something dragging across the wood, just below the latch. A short pause, then again. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. I clicked it on and held it toward the door. I thought about yelling just to scare off whatever it was, but something in me knew not to make a sound. I felt pinned to the cot, like if I moved too fast, something would crash through the door. The scraping stopped after maybe 30 seconds. I waited for 5 full minutes before I got up and crept toward the door. My hands were shaking. I slowly cracked the wooden shutter over the window and looked out into the dark. Nothing. No movement. No tracks I could see. Just stillness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked outside again. Sure enough, on the front of the cabin, below the latch, were more of those marks. This time shorter, shallower, but the same angle, the same pressure. Like someone testing the door with a tool or a sharp stone. That was when I started to really consider leaving. I had a few days of supplies left, but I didn't feel safe. My gut told me that someone was out there, and they knew I was alone. They hadn't tried to come in yet, but they were watching. Or worse, they were waiting. Still, I stayed one more night. I don't know why. Stubbornness, maybe, or disbelief. I felt like if I could just get through it, it would stop. But it didn't. That night, just after I turned off the light and climbed into my bag, I heard something move behind the cabin. Not a scrape, not a branch. This was heavier. Footsteps, slow and careful, moving just along the wall. I froze. I counted the steps. 3, 4. Then they stopped. And then I heard it, the unmistakable creak of the back window frame. I hadn't even thought to check if it was locked. It was an old window, the kind that slides upward. I had never used it, but maybe it could be forced. I got up fast and moved toward the stove. I grabbed the poker and stood there, heart hammering. The window creaked again. Then silence. I didn't hear anything for the rest of the night, but I didn't sleep either. I just sat there until the sky lightened. When morning came, I went outside to check the back wall. The window had been slid upward about 2 inches, just enough to break the seal. There were prints on the ledge, not boots or shoes, but the smudge of fingers, bare hands, and below the window another mark, deeper this time. I packed up. I didn't even eat. I stuffed everything into my pack, doused the fire in the stove, and left. I didn't care that it was still early. I wanted distance. I wanted roads and people and phones. I didn't stop until I reached the truck. The whole way back down the trail, I felt watched. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone step out of the trees, but no one did. I never went back. I tried to tell the guy who owned the place what happened. I emailed him and told him I thought someone had been messing with the cabin, maybe living out there. I sent pictures of the marks. He replied once, just said, "Thanks, I'll check on it." The site disappeared a few months later. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some twisted loner living off the grid. Maybe someone who didn't want company, but it felt personal, like they'd been waiting for someone like me. Alone, isolated, with no way to call for help. That's what scared me the most. It wasn't just the scratches or the footsteps or the open window. It was the fact that they never rushed it. They took their time, came closer every night, like they were studying me. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I'd have walked out. Not on my own. I don't usually take time off, especially not during the fall when work piles up faster than I can clear it. But this time, something in me just needed to get away. I'd been running on fumes for months, waking up tired, eating poorly, zoning out at work, forgetting things. I didn't want to go to a hotel or a city. I wanted something quiet and isolated. So I searched online and found a listing for a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It wasn't anything fancy. No Wi-Fi, no TV, no neighbors, just a small wooden cabin near a frozen lake with enough firewood stacked to last a month. It was owned by some retired guy who didn't live there anymore. I booked a week and packed my gear. I figured I'd read, chop wood, cook simple meals, and just exist without anyone needing anything from me. The drive up took about 7 hours. Most of it was paved highway, but the last 30 miles were all gravel, winding through dense woods. Trees closed in on both sides like they hadn't seen a chainsaw in decades. It was already dusk when I pulled up to the cabin. The air was sharp and cold. I stepped out and could hear nothing. No traffic, no voices, not even birds. Just the wind moving through the trees like someone whispering low and slow. The cabin was basic. One room with a wood-burning stove, a small bed, a table and a chair. There was a little kitchen with a gas burner and a few cabinets. I brought a cooler full of food and a couple jugs of water since there was no running tap. An outhouse stood behind the cabin, far enough that I didn't want to make the trip more than necessary. The guy who owned the place had left a small journal with notes. How to light the stove, how to open the flue, where to find the spare key. On the first page, he'd written, "This place is meant to be quiet. Let it stay that way." The first night, I didn't sleep great. I kept waking up every hour. The woods around the cabin creaked and groaned. The wind had a way of slipping between the boards and making strange, low sounds. I figured it was just my nerves adjusting to being so alone. The next day, I got up early and made coffee on the gas burner. I carried a mug outside and stood on the little porch, looking out across the frost-covered trees and the frozen lake behind them. It was dead silent, like the whole world had stopped. I walked the edge of the lake that morning, sticking close to the shoreline. The ice was thick, but I didn't trust it. I saw a few sets of animal tracks, deer, maybe a fox, something larger too, maybe a coyote or a wolf. I didn't think much of it. It's Minnesota. There's plenty of wildlife up there. That afternoon I chopped wood for a couple hours, just to keep warm and moving. I kept glancing into the woods, feeling like I was being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia from being alone. I hadn't seen another person in hours. I hadn't even seen a plane overhead. It felt like I'd fallen off the edge of the map. Later that night, something woke me up. It was probably close to 2 or 3 in the morning. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I realized I was hearing movement, crunching footsteps in the snow outside. Slow, deliberate, not a deer or small animal. It was too heavy, too paced. I sat up and held my breath. The footsteps circled the cabin once, maybe twice, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. After maybe 10 minutes, they faded into the woods. The next morning, I stepped outside, heart pounding. I checked the snow and found footprints. They were boot prints, human. One set, heavy tread, probably men's size 10 or 11. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, and went back into the trees on the opposite side. No tracks leading in from a road, no vehicle prints, just someone walking through the woods. That didn't sit right. I told myself maybe it was a hunter, someone passing through, but I knew that wasn't likely. It wasn't hunting season, and the cabin was miles from any known trail or access point. I checked my car. No damage. I opened the door. Everything inside was untouched. But I noticed something odd. The gas tank, which I had topped off before arriving, had dropped to about 3/4. I didn't remember driving that much. Couldn't be sure. I shook it off. That afternoon, I didn't go far. I stayed close to the cabin, kept the fire going, and spent most of my time inside reading. I had a .22 rifle with me, just a little survival piece I brought on backwoods trips. I loaded it and leaned it next to the door. I still told myself it was nothing, but I wasn't taking chances. That night, it happened again. The footsteps. Same time, same pace. This time, I didn't just wait. I got up, crept to the window, and looked out. The moon was bright enough that I could see movement. A figure standing just at the tree line, maybe 30 yards away. Not moving, not making noise, just standing there, watching the cabin. I couldn't make out a face. They were wearing a heavy jacket and a hat. I couldn't tell if it was a man or not. I stepped back from the window, grabbed the rifle, and waited. I didn't turn on any lights. After 10 minutes, I looked again. The figure was gone. The next morning, I found more prints in the snow. They led closer to the cabin this time, right up to the porch. I checked the door. It was locked, but the handle had smudges on it, like someone had tried to open it with gloved hands. I walked the perimeter and found something else. 2 cigarette butts near the outhouse. Fresh, still slightly warm. Whoever it was, they'd been closer than I thought. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call anyone, no signal. I thought about driving out, but part of me didn't want to be seen leaving. If someone was watching the road, they'd know I was alone. I stayed another night, but I barely slept. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept the fire low, kept the lights off. The footsteps didn't come again that night, But the next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the side of the cabin, someone had carved a symbol into the wood. It wasn't a word or anything I recognized, just a deep slash with 2 curved lines beneath it, like some kind of mark or tag. It had been done recently. The wood was still fresh and splintered. I couldn't stay. I packed everything up that morning, loaded the car, and started the drive out. I kept checking the rearview mirror. The woods were empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. At one point, several miles down the gravel road, I stopped to take a leak. When I got back to the car, I noticed new footprints near the back bumper. Ones that hadn't been there when I parked. Someone was following me, on foot. I got in the car and didn't stop again until I hit paved road. I drove straight through to Duluth and stayed in a motel for the night. I didn't sleep there either, just kept the light on and stared at the door. I drove home the next day. A week later, I got a call from the cabin owner. I'd left a note in the guest book saying something weird had happened and someone had been near the place at night. He called to say he'd gone up to check and found the cabin had been broken into. The back window was shattered. Inside, he said it looked like someone had been living there, food wrappers, cigarette butts, empty cans. Whoever it was had stayed a while after I left. He said the strangest thing was the journal, the one he left with notes about the cabin. The last page had a message scribbled on it in pencil. "You shouldn't have come alone." He asked me if I'd written that. I told him no. I hadn't even touched the journal after the first day. That was the last time I ever went to a cabin alone. I still think about it, usually at night when everything is quiet. I don't know who that person was or what they wanted. I don't know how long they were watching me or how close they really got. But I know this much, there's nothing supernatural out there. No ghosts, no monsters, just people. And sometimes that's a hell of a lot worse. It was supposed to be a quiet break. I'd been pushing myself too hard for months. Long shifts, constant deadlines, barely sleeping, and I finally took a few days off. I wanted to go somewhere completely disconnected, where there was no signal, no noise, no people. A friend of mine had once stayed at a small cabin up in the northern woods, just a couple miles from the Canadian border. He said it was remote enough that you could go a whole weekend without seeing another person, but it wasn't completely off-grid. There was a basic generator, a water tank that refilled from a stream, and a propane stove. That was all I needed. I didn't even bring my laptop. Just a backpack of clothes, some dried food, a couple books, and a .22 rifle just in case I ran into a coyote or something. I'm not a hunter, but I'm not stupid either. Out there, you're on your own. The drive up took me almost 9 hours. The last 45 minutes were on a logging road, mostly gravel and dirt, winding through dense woods with no signs or markers. I had the GPS downloaded offline and followed it as best I could. Once I saw the old rusted gate, half hanging off its hinges. I knew I was close. I drove another 5 minutes until I reached the clearing. The cabin was exactly as I expected. Small, weathered, single story. It looked like no one had touched it for years. I parked off to the side, got out, and just stood there for a moment. The air was cold and still. Pine trees surrounded the clearing like a wall, dense and tall, and it was dead silent. No cars, no birds, just wind rustling through the branches. The front door was stiff but opened with some pressure. Inside was basic. One small room with a wood stove, a little table, a cot, and some shelves. There was a separate door leading to what looked like a storage area, probably where the previous owner kept tools. I set my bag down and walked through the place slowly, checking for rodents or signs of animals. It looked clean enough, dusty but clean. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some instant noodles, read a few chapters of a paperback I brought, and turned in early. I could hear the trees creaking outside and wind against the windows. I fell asleep thinking this was exactly what I needed. It was the second day that things started to feel a little strange. I woke up at around 6 in the morning. It was still dark out, but something had stirred me from sleep. I wasn't sure what. Maybe the wind again. I lay still for a minute, just listening. There was a steady tapping sound, like something light hitting the window. I figured it was a branch, but when I got up and looked, there was nothing touching the glass. just the forest, motionless. Later that day, I decided to explore a little. I took a trail that led east of the cabin and followed it for about half a mile. The woods were thick, but peaceful. I didn't see any wildlife, but I did find what looked like the remains of an old hunting blind, rotted and half collapsed. I sat there for a while and ate some jerky from my pack before heading back. That's when I noticed something off. When I returned to the cabin, the door was open. Not wide open, but cracked. I was certain I had closed it. I always do. Still, maybe I didn't shut it tight enough and the wind got it. That was possible. I walked in slowly, rifle slung over my shoulder, and looked around. Nothing seemed touched. My bag was still where I left it. Food was untouched. The book I'd been reading was still on the table, pages open where I left off. I made sure to lock the door that night. There was a bolt on the inside, and I slid it across before turning in. I also checked the windows. They all latched from the inside. I didn't want animals or people coming in uninvited. I woke up again at night. This time it was to a sound that was clearly footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and close. Not on the porch, but just outside the cabin. The ground was covered in dry needles and leaves, and I could hear the crunch of someone stepping carefully, slowly. My heart started pounding. I sat up in the cot and waited. I didn't move. The steps circled around the cabin. One side, then the other, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the rifle across my lap and sat in a chair by the window. I watched the woods until morning came. When the light finally started breaking through the trees, I walked outside. No footprints. The ground was dry and loose, so maybe they didn't leave marks, or maybe I imagined it. I wanted to believe that. The third day, I kept close to the cabin. I chopped some kindling and res-tacked the woodpile. I checked the small shed attached to the side of the cabin. Inside were some tools, an old axe, and rusted cans of nails and screws. Nothing out of place. I opened the generator cover and checked the fuel level. It was a little lower than I remembered, but I figured maybe I used more than I thought. I made coffee and sat on the steps of the porch, scanning the woods. It was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet anymore. Felt like the forest was waiting. That evening, I didn't want to cook inside. I set up a small fire pit a few yards from the porch and made a simple meal, just beans and bread. As I ate, I kept looking up, feeling like I wasn't alone. I kept hearing things. Not big obvious noises, just tiny cracks and snaps, like twigs under pressure. Always just out of sight. I killed the fire before full dark and went inside, bolting the door again. I checked all the windows twice. Then I pulled the cot into the corner of the room where I could see both the door and the window across from it. I didn't sleep right away. I sat up with the rifle beside me, listening. Around 2 in the morning, there was a noise again. Not footsteps this time, a scraping sound. It was slow and dragged out. I thought it might be an animal at first, but when I looked toward the window, I saw the shadow of a hand. It wasn't a full silhouette, just the faint outline of fingers brushing across the glass. I held my breath and didn't move. The fingers moved slowly, tracing the window frame, then paused. I sat frozen for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the shadow moved away. I didn't hear steps, just silence. I didn't sleep that night either. When morning came, I stepped outside with the rifle ready. I scanned the tree line, looked behind the cabin, even checked the roof. Nothing. I circled the building and noticed something strange near the back. In the soft dirt by the generator, I saw a boot print. It wasn't mine. It was wider and had a deeper heel. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. I packed everything into my bag. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to leave. I got in the car and backed out toward the dirt road. About 100 yards from the cabin, I hit the brakes. Right there, just off the side of the road, tucked between trees, was a tent. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. It was dark green, small, barely visible through the trees. I stared at it for a minute, trying to decide what to do. I knew I shouldn't stop, but part of me needed to know who had been out there. I left the car running and walked toward the tent. I kept the rifle in my hands, finger near the trigger guard but not on it. The tent flap was closed. I stood there for a few seconds, then called out. Nothing. Not a sound. I took a deep breath, crouched, and unzipped the flap slowly. It was empty, sort of. There was a sleeping bag crumpled, a camp stove, a few empty cans, a map. The map was what got me. It was hand-marked. My cabin was circled in red ink. And not just the cabin, there were little notes around it. Woodpile, west window sight line, good cover here, stuff like that. I stared at it, stomach twisting. Someone had been watching me, tracking me. I backed away, zipped the tent shut, and ran back to the car. I didn't stop again. I followed the road back to the main highway and didn't even pull over until I hit a gas station almost an hour south. I filled up, sat in the car, and just breathed. I reported what I saw to the nearest ranger station. They said they'd check it out, but they didn't sound surprised. Apparently, sometimes squatters or survivalist types set up on public land and just live out there for months. One ranger said I was lucky the guy didn't try anything. I didn't feel lucky. I didn't go back for the rest of my stuff. I didn't want the book or the food or anything else I left in that cabin. I never even asked my friend where he heard about it in the first place. I blocked it all out. That trip was supposed to be a break, a time to disconnect, recharge, get some peace. Instead, it reminded me how vulnerable we really are. Out there, miles from help, completely isolated, no fences or walls or neighbors. You're just prey if someone decides you're worth watching. Since then, I haven't gone back into the woods alone, not even to hike. I don't trust the quiet anymore, because that quiet is not always empty. I rented a cheap cabin off an old guy who barely looked me in the eye. He stood there on the porch, arms crossed, face leathery and stiff. When he handed me the keys, he said, "It's quiet out there." And that was it. No smile, no eye contact. Just those 4 words. I needed quiet. That's why I took the place. I was burned out. Work had been grinding me down for years. Deadlines, traffic, crowds, city noise, sirens all night. I had trouble sleeping, my thoughts always racing. I was snapping at people, drinking too much. My hands shook sometimes and my chest felt tight for no reason. My doctor said I needed rest. I needed time away from screens, meetings, phones buzzing every 10 minutes. So I decided to take 2 weeks off. No laptop, no phone, just me, some paperbacks, and silence. The cabin was 2 hours from the city. The roads turned to dirt halfway through the drive, winding into thick trees. I didn't see another house for miles. The forest was dense, pine and birch mostly, and the only sounds were birds and the wind. When I pulled up to the cabin, I felt something loosen in my chest. It was small and old, made of weathered wood, with a slanted roof and a crooked porch. There was 1 bedroom, a bathroom with just a toilet and sink, and a main room with a wood stove, a couch, a little kitchen area, and a rickety table. No internet, no TV. I didn't care. I was here to rest. The first 2 days were quiet, just like the old man said. I cooked simple meals, eggs, beans, toast. I read, wrote in a notebook, chopped wood for the stove. I slept a lot. For the first time in months, my shoulders stopped feeling like they were up around my ears. I thought, this is exactly what I needed. But on the 3rd night, something changed. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound, scratching, light like nails on wood, coming from behind the wall next to the bed. At first, I figured it was a mouse or a squirrel. The cabin was old and in the middle of the woods. Animals getting into walls was normal. I banged the wall with my fist, and the scratching stopped. I went back to sleep. The next night, it came back. Same time, a little after 2 a.m. This time, it wasn't just scratching. There was a slow tapping, too, like something lightly dragging over the inside of the wall. Not scurrying, not chewing, just slow, deliberate movement. I listened for a while, then got out of bed, turned on the light, and tapped the wall back. The sound stopped. It made my skin crawl, but I told myself it was nothing. Some animal. I even laughed at myself for being so jumpy. But when it came back again the next night, again right around 2, I felt something tighten in my stomach. It wasn't louder. It wasn't more aggressive. But it was always the same. Same time, same spot. I grabbed a flashlight and started tapping around the wall. Eventually, I pried off one of the thin wooden panels near where the sound had come from. Behind it was a layer of old insulation and wood framing. No nest, no droppings, no sign of animals. But I did find a hole. It was small, maybe the size of a pencil, about chest height when I stood up. I leaned in close, shone the flashlight into it. Nothing, just more darkness. I crouched and looked from the side, and that's when I realized the hole wasn't random. It was bored through the inside layer of the wall, but not all the way through to the outside. It was angled slightly, pointing toward the bed, like someone had made it to look through, like an eye hole that gave me a weird, prickling feeling. I told myself maybe it was an old vent or a place where a cable had been run once, but it didn't look like that. It looked intentional. I didn't sleep in the bedroom that night. I lay on the couch with a blanket and a knife under the pillow. I tried to laugh at myself again, but it didn't work. The next morning, I went outside to get some air. The sky was gray, cold wind pushing through the trees. I walked around the side of the cabin, looking at the outer wall where the hole would be. There was nothing unusual there, just more wooden siding, some moss, dirt. But then I noticed something. Footprints. They weren't mine. I always wore hiking boots with a thick sole. These were barefoot, human, adult-sized. They led from the treeline to the side of the cabin, right near the bedroom wall and back again. The ground was soft, muddy in spots from rain the night before. The prints were clear. I looked around, heart beating fast. No one in sight. No sound but wind and leaves. I stood still for a long time, waiting for something to move in the woods. Nothing did. I went back inside and locked the doors. I poured flour outside all the doors and windows. Just a light layer, enough to catch a print. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, ears tuned for every sound. I didn't hear scratching, no tapping, just silence. Somehow, that was worse. At first light, I got up and opened the back door. Footprints, bare feet, coming up to the back door, stepping right through the flour, and then back into the woods. Someone had come up to the cabin while I was inside. Quietly, they hadn't tried to open the door. They hadn't knocked, just walked up and stood there. That was enough. I didn't even pack properly. I shoved everything I could into my duffel, left the food behind, didn't even brush my teeth. I started the car and drove, fast. Didn't stop until I hit the highway. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't report it to the police. I didn't want to deal with it. I just wanted to forget it. Weeks later, back in the city, I couldn't let it go. I started wondering who the hell had been out there, what they wanted, why they didn't try to break in, why they watched, why that hole was there. I looked up the cabin online, found the listing. It was still there. Same pictures, same price, no mention of anything weird, but there were reviews. Most were short, basic stuff, quiet, cozy, rustic, but one review stood out. From 2 years ago, a woman. She wrote that she loved the location, that it was peaceful, that she had planned to stay for a month. The review was short, nothing alarming, but when I Googled her name out of curiosity, something came up. A missing persons report. She had gone missing the same week that review was posted. No sign of a struggle. Her car was still at the cabin. Her bags still inside. It was like she just walked out into the woods and vanished. Police searched the area for weeks. No body, no tracks, no suspects. I sat staring at my screen for a long time. That hole in the wall, the footprints, the fact that whoever was out there never tried to break in. It made sense in the worst possible way. They weren't trying to scare me. They were watching, waiting, picking a time when someone was most vulnerable, when they let their guard down, when they were asleep in bed. I think the only reason I didn't end up like her is because I heard something early. I reacted. I got scared and left. I didn't give them the chance. I think someone lives out in those woods. Someone who watches that cabin. Someone who waits. I never went back. Never contacted the old man. I left a review, but it was vague. just said I didn't feel safe there. It got buried under newer ones. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I look up similar cabins. I check the reviews, read between the lines. I don't know what I'm looking for. Maybe I just want to see if it happens again. But I'll never go back out there. That place wasn't just quiet. It was watched.